Windows Server 2008 comes with an improved version of terminal services, first introduced in Windows Server 2000. Using remote desktop connection, multiple users can connect to the same server, run applications, and even have their own desktop. The easiest way to think of terminal servers is to think of a remote control car. Through the controller, you can control the remote control car and make it move. The same with terminal services. The application runs on the terminal server, and you simply provide the remote control. There are a lot of cost benefits to terminal services. Firstly, you can better utilize your hardware. Most servers you will find spend most of their time idle. When a user opens an application, the CPU goes up for a second or two and then goes back to idle. Having multiple users on the same system makes better use of the CPU. In the real world, while one user is using the CPU, the other users are not. In the end, it all balances out. Next, you can reduce your application licensing costs. If you have an expensive application that end users need once in a blue moon, you may consider putting it on a terminal server. Doing this reduces the cost of having multiple licenses. Putting the application on a terminal server can also reduce your deployment costs. If you have 100 users connected to your terminal server, you can deploy the application once on the terminal server and all users will have the application. Since the computer connecting to terminal server does not need to run applications locally, the computer does not have to be highly spec'd. Instead of purchasing new computers, you can use old computers to run the terminal services client. Since the computer simply takes the user's input and displays the data from your terminal server, you can also use diskless workstations for your end user. In the past, you may have used remote desktop connection to perform administration on your server. Both terminal services and remote desktop use the same client. Remote desktop also uses the same library files and code as terminal services. The big difference between the two is how they are licensed. If you have Windows Vista, you can use remote desktop connection to access your computer from remote. When you access your computer from remote, Windows Vista will lock your workstation. This stops a user using it at the console and one from remote, essentially making Windows Vista a mini terminal server. Windows Server 2008 allows you to connect two administrators via remote desktop connection at the same time. This means two administrators could be making changes to a remote server at the same time. With Windows Server 2008 and remote desktop, it is designed to provide a way for administrators to make changes to a server. You could run applications in an admin session, but as you will find out later on, Terminal Services has some additional features which make it more suitable for running applications in a multi-user environment. Keep in mind, you can only have two users connected at once via remote desktop connection, and if you use the admin software on the server, this gets reduced to one. This means, if you open the console for Terminal Services on Windows Server 2008, only one administrator can connect via remote desktop connection. Terminal Services builds on remote desktop and thus has more features aimed at providing terminal services for a large number of users. Before you can use remote desktop, you need to enable it on your server. To do this, switch it on in System Properties and then select the users you want to have remote access. Remote desktop is very easy to set up and requires no additional licenses or costs to run. Let's have a look how to enable remote desktop. To enable remote desktop, open the System Properties and go to the Remote tab. You can do this from the control panel, but I find it faster to open Server Manager and then select the option Configure Remote Desktop. This will open the System Properties and take you straight to the Remote tab. From here, all you need to do is allow remote desktop connections. The bottom option provides the most security. This requires computers to support network-level authentication before they can connect. Windows Server 2008 and Windows Vista support this. If you are running Windows XP, you can download an update to provide this level of security. If your computers can't run the latest client, select the option Allow connections from computers running any version of remote desktop. The biggest difference with the older and the newer client is network level authentication will prompt you for credentials before showing a login screen. With the older client, it is possible to have the login screen appear to an end user that does not have access to the server. This puts additional load on the server and can be used in a denial of service attack. An attacker can force a large amount of login screens to be created on the server using all its resources and thus slowing the server down and stopping legitimate users from using the terminal server. With network level authentication, the login screen is not created until the user has been authenticated, and thus, an attacker cannot create a large amount of login screens and thus cause a denial of service attack. When you enable Remote Desktop, a dialog will appear letting you know that a firewall rule will be created automatically for you. Next, select the option Select Users. From here, you can add any users that you'd like to have access to the server. You will notice the local administrator already has access. That's it for Remote Desktop. Very easy to use and set up. If you are running Server Core, then you will need to run a script to enable Remote Desktop. To enable Remote Desktop, run the following command from the command prompt. This will enable Remote Desktop using any version of Remote Desktop. If you want to make sure end users connect using network level authentication, then you'll also need to run the following script. If you want to know what the settings are currently set to, run the command with the /AR/V switches. For example, to find out if Remote Desktop is currently enabled, run the following. Keep in mind that Server Core does not provide any desktop interface even through Remote Desktop. If you connect to a Server Core computer with Remote Desktop, you will be given a command prompt. If you want to disable Remote Desktop or change the security settings, simply change the 0 value at the end of the line to a 1. Due to the fact Server Core does not have a full set of graphical binaries installed, even in a Remote Desktop session, you will still only have access to some basic GUI functionality. In some cases, Remote Desktop will give you all the features that you need. If, however, you need a multi-user solution, you should consider using terminal services. First, there is an improved multi-user capability. This is done by having two modes, Execute and Install mode. To switch between these modes, run the command Change User from the command prompt with either /install or /execute parameter. While in install mode, Windows Server 2008 monitors the server for changes in the registry and INI files. These changes are recorded and then used to support multiple users. For example, if an application stores data in an INI file in the Windows directory, this INI file could be changed by all users on the terminal server. One user could thus change a setting that could affect all users. To combat this, when in install mode, INI file changes and registry changes are tracked. A copy of these changes are stored in the user's profile. When a program attempts to change these settings in the INI file, the program is redirected to the user profile and the settings are changed there. This is done completely transparently to the program and thus gives the user per user settings that would normally be machine only. If you have installed any applications on your server before you installed terminal services, you should reinstall these applications after you install terminal services. This makes sure that any settings that the application installs are correctly recorded in install mode. Terminal services comes with a number of different features. Some are new and others are improvements from previous versions found in Windows Server 2003. A new addition to terminal services is Remote App. This allows a user to run an application on the server like it was on their local computer. Normally, the user would connect up to terminal services and a desktop would be presented to them. From here, they could run their application. Remote App allows the user to run an application on their computer without having to be given a remote desktop. This means an end user could be given a shortcut on their desktop to launch an application. On running the shortcut, the application will be displayed on their local computer like any other application. The application still runs on the terminal server, and this arrangement allows the end user to have the best of both worlds. Using Remote App, a user can have a mixture of both local and remote applications running on the same desktop. Remote App is a big addition to terminal services in Windows Server 2008. If you want to simplify the way users connect up to terminal services, you may want to consider installing TS Web Access. With Terminal Services Web Access, the end user can access a remote terminal server using their web browser. The user can access applications through links on a website, for example, the company's intranet site. All the user needs to do is launch the application is to click on the link on the company's website. If you start using terminal services, as your needs grow, you may need to deploy more and more servers. A number of servers together is called a farm. In this case, You may have the same application running on a number of servers to provide redundancy. From an end user's point of view, they want to simply click on an icon to open the application. They do not want to have to choose a server to run the application on or have to remember which server they were on if they get disconnected. Using network load balancing or DNS round-robin distribution, you can deploy a number of servers in your farm with the same application or applications. When the user clicks on their icon to launch the application, the user request is directed to one of the servers. This does a good job of distributing load throughout the servers, but when a user gets disconnected and tries to relaunch their application, they may find that they have been reconnected to a different server. This is where Terminal Services Session Broker comes in. If a client is disconnected, the Terminal Services Session Broker locates the user's session and then reconnects the user back to their session. If you are running more than one server, you should install the Terminal Services Session Broker to ensure that when a user gets disconnected, they are reconnected back to their original server. Lastly, Windows Server 2008 comes with Terminal Services Gateway. Terminal Services Gateway allows authorized users to access your service from outside your organization. It does this by tunneling your session through HTTPS. By doing this, it eliminates the need to have your end user create a VPN to your organization. This allows your user and trusted third parties to access applications on your server from the internet securely. Let's have a look how to install Terminal Services. First of all, open Server Manager from Administrative Tools under the Start menu. From here, you want to select Roles and then press the option Add Roles. Press Next at the welcome screen and then select Terminal Services from the list of roles. The next screen will give you some information about Terminal Services. Now you need to select the components of Terminal Server that you want to install. You will notice that if I select TS Licensing, I do not need to install Terminal Server with it. Terminal Services Licensing can run completely standalone with no other Terminal Services components. It is up to you which server you install it on, as long as the other Terminal Services in your domain or forest can access it. For this install, I am going to select Terminal Server. This screen warns you that if you install Terminal Services, you will need to reinstall your applications. This is because when the applications were installed, they were not installed in install mode. If you have any applications already installed on your server, they may not function correctly after you install Terminal Services until you reinstall the application. Make sure that when you reinstall the application, that you reinstall the application in install mode. Next, you need to set the default level of authentication for that server. I will select any version of remote desktop can be used to connect to this Terminal Server. You can always change this after Terminal Server has been installed. Next you have the licensing screen. I will go into licensing later on in the course. However, here you can select if your Terminal Server will work in per device mode or per user mode. Don't worry too much if you don't know what to set this option to. It can be configured later on. When you install Terminal Services, you get a 128-day trial. You have until the end of the trial to set up your licensing. Next you have the user groups that can access the server. On most application servers, you'll probably want to add domain users. At the end of the day, it really depends on what kind of security you need on your server. The last screen will provide a summary before Terminal Services is installed. On this server, some software has already been installed. After Terminal Services has been installed, I will need to go back and reinstall these applications to make sure that these settings are recorded correctly in install mode. If I fail to do this, these applications may not work correctly in a Terminal Services environment. Once you have Terminal Services installed, you may need to add some additional features depending on your needs. Features in Windows Server 2008 are small components that enable additional functionality in your operating system. There are many different features in Windows Server 2008. Here are a few that you may consider installing with Windows Terminal Services. Firstly, you may want to consider installing the desktop experience. This feature installs Windows Media Player 11, Photo Gallery, and the Aero interface. Even though Aero is installed, this feature will still need to be enabled. Next, you may want to consider installing the Windows System Resource Manager. This will make sure that applications use only the resources that they are allocated. By doing this gives your end user a more consistent and predictable experience. If your user is using multimedia, you should consider installing this feature, Quality Windows Audio Video Experience. This feature monitors audio and video and takes steps to maintain the quality of service. Having said this, terminal services are not always the best choice if you are planning on deploying video and audio. If you are on a fast local area network, the video and audio from terminal services may be acceptable. If you are on a wide area network with slow performance, this will not work as well, even with this feature. Remember, terminal services works best under certain scenarios. If your terminal services solution requires a lot of network activity over a slow link, you should consider a different solution. If you are planning on using terminal services in a terminal services farm, you should consider installing the feature Network Load Balancing. This allows you to have the load from your users shared among the servers in your server farm. Features are installed much the same way as roles are. Let's have a look how to install features. To install features on Windows Server 2008, open the Server Manager from Administrative Tools in the Start menu. The procedure is much the same as installing roles. Simply select Features on the left-hand side and then press the option Add Features on the right-hand side. From here, select the features that you want to add. I will select Desktop Experience, Network Load Balancing, Quality Windows Audio Experience, and Windows System Resource Manager. If a feature requires another feature to be installed, that is, it has a dependency, you'll be given the chance to add that feature as well. If you are not sure what a feature does, there is some brief text explaining it on the right-hand side. Also, if you click on the blue link, this will take you into the help for a more detailed description. Press Next and the feature will be installed. That's it. Adding features and roles in Windows Server 2008 is a snap. To change the settings for terminal server sessions, you need to edit the RDP TCP properties. This is found in Terminal Servers Configuration Console or TSC Console. The name RDP TCP may sound a little bit strange, but what it is essentially saying is this: these settings will be used on any connection that uses RDP over TCP. In other words, any session that uses the RDP protocol over TCP/IP. In a simple network, this will cover all your incoming connections, since all your connections should be using RDP over TCP/IP. If your server has multiple network adapters, you may want to create multiple RDP connections. By default, all adapters will use the settings in the default RDP TCP connection. In some cases, you may want to have different settings per adapter. In this case, you need to create another connection type. You may, for example, have a fast network card that can handle more connections. On some networks, you may have users on a secure network and others on a less secure network accessing the same terminal server and thus needing different settings. To protect the intellectual property on a secure network, you may need to disable things like the clipboard. Later on, I will cover different settings that can be configured. But first, let's look how to create a new connection. First of all, run Terminal Services Configuration from the Start menu. This is found under Terminal Services and Administrative Tools. In this example, I have two network cards in the server. You can see the default RDP TCP settings. By default, this will use all available network cards. I need to change this so I will only use one before I can add a new connection. To do this, access the properties of RDP TCP and select Network Adapter. Set the network adapter to network card 1. If I tried to add a new connection without doing this, I would get an error message stating that the connection must have its own transporter type or adapter. This is basically telling you that there is no free adapter to apply the settings to. The first network card is connected to my regular network. The second network card is connected to my secure network. Users in the secure network want to be able to access the internet. However, the intellectual property on this network must be protected. The intellectual property cannot be copied from the secure network. This means I need two groups of settings, one for the secure network and one for the regular network. First of all, I select the option Create New Connection. From here, it is a simple matter of selecting a name and a comment for the new connection. Once I have done this, I can select the adapter that it is going to use and the maximum number of connections that adapter can support. In this case, I will select 5. This is one way to control the number of users that are accessing the terminal server. Once I press Finish on the wizard, my new connection will be available under the default RDP-TCP connection. This allows me to set different settings for the secure network and the regular network. Let's have a look at some of the properties you can set. In the Properties section for the network connection, you can set a large number of settings which will affect only the sessions that come through that connection. In a basic setup, you will only have the default RDP-TCP connection. In this scenario, these settings will be used for all sessions that come to that terminal server. The main settings that you may want to consider changing are the security settings. From here, you can decide what encryption is required for the client to connect. Also, you can select if network level authentication is required. Setting the security too high will mean that some down-level clients will not be able to connect to your terminal server. The default options will negotiate with the client to determine the highest level of encryption supported. If you do not have any special security needs, I would recommend leaving these settings on the defaults. The next properties that you may want to consider changing are session handling. These settings determine when to disconnect sessions that are running on the server. This can help stop your server becoming full of inactive sessions. On a busy terminal server, you can easily spend a lot of administration time removing these sessions. Depending on your needs and legal requirements, you may want to change the settings in remote control. These settings determine if the user will be prompted before you take control of their session, and you can even disable remote control completely. Lastly, you may want to set the client settings that will be available to the user. These settings set the features available to the user and also act as security settings. For example, in the case of our secure network, the ability for the user to use the clipboard needs to be disabled. Also access to the ports. These features, if left available, could be used to copy intellectual property from the network. For performance reasons, you may want to disable the sound or limit the color depth for your sessions. Keep in mind that some of the settings can be set in the user account or in the client. If you disable the settings on the server, the user or client settings will be overridden. Let's go through configuring a few settings on the secure connection on my server. First of all, I will open Terminal Services Configuration. Next, I'll select Secure Connection and then select Properties. Any sessions that connect through this adapter will get the settings I'm about to change. On the General tab, you can set a number of security settings. First, the security layer. With the settings on Negotiate, the server will use SSL encryption when supported by both the client and server. If SSL is not supported, RDP encryption will be used instead. Keep in mind, to run SSL correctly, you need to be able to access a trusted certificate authority. Next, you can set the encryption level for RDP connections. By default, the server will select the highest level of encryption the client can support. If you wish, you can set the minimum level required. If you want the best performance, but not worried about security, select Low. If you want the best security possible, select FIPS. However, this will limit the clients that can connect to your terminal server. Lastly, there is an option for allow connections from computers running remote desktop with network level authentication. Network level authentication means the user is authenticated before they are given a desktop or login screen. Older editions of terminal server, you could reach the login screen without providing a username or password. This could be exploited by an attacker to create a denial of service attack. The next tab is Logon Settings. If you are setting up a kiosk, you may want to consider using this tab. With this tab, sessions created with this connection use the username and password supplied. This allows users to create a session on your terminal server without a username and password. The next tab, Sessions, is something you may want to consider setting. Here you can decide the action to perform when a session meets certain conditions. For example, you can automatically disconnect a session after it has been running for a while. The setting I am interested in is Idle Session Limit. After a session has been idle for an hour, I want the session to be disconnected. The next tab, Environment, can be used for when supporting a kiosk. If I always want to run the same program when a session is started, I can enter in the program in here. Perhaps you want a menu screen to appear or show the terms and conditions when the user logs in. This screen can also stop the user running programs when they log in. This can be helpful if the users start running their own applications, causing the server to slow down. The Remote Control tab allows you to take control of users' sessions. Depending on your needs and legal issues, you may need to have the user's authorization before you can take control of their session. In my case, I want to be able to access the end user screen to support them if they have problems. However, HR won't allow me to have access to their screen unless I get their permission first. Check your company policy before you set this. Next, you may want to change the client settings. From here, you can limit the number of colors the user can see. More colors means slower performance and more RAM. Since this is a secure network with intellectual property, I want to disable some of the redirection options. Redirection allows the user to access certain resources on the local PC from the terminal server. Switching on the drive option stops the end user being able to access their local hard drive from the terminal server session. In order to access local drives from a terminal server session, the local drive option must also be enabled in the Local Resource tab in the Remote Desktop client. Since this is a secure network, local drives must be switched off to prevent unauthorized copying. Next, there is a Windows printer option. This means the user can print to the local printer from the terminal session. The options LPR port and COM port allow the terminal server session to access the local LPT port and COM ports. On a secure environment, this needs to be switched off. A user could install a portable hard disk to a COM port or an LPT port. Next, there is the clipboard. This allows the user to copy and paste between their local applications and the application running on the terminal server. In a secure network, this needs to be switched off. On your network, it depends on your needs. If you are running terminal services over a slow network connection, you may want to switch this option off. If a user attempts to paste a large amount of clipboard data over a slow network connection, their session will hang. From a support point of view, if the user does not need the clipboard, it may be worth switching off when you're running terminal services over a slow network connection. The audio option can be a great performance saver. If you don't require audio, it is best to switch it off on slow networks. In most applications, the user will not miss the audio. The next option, support for plug-and-play devices, means that when you plug a device into your local computer, it can get redirected to your terminal services session. Basically, this means your local plug-and-play device will be available in your terminal services session. If you are just running terminal services to give your end users remote access to a particular application, it is best to switch this option off. Switching this option on, when not needed, can confuse the end user. Imagine they plug in their USB device into their computer and it gets redirected to the terminal server session. When the user opens Windows Explorer on the local computer, their USB drive will be missing, but in the terminal services session, it will be available. This can easily confuse the end user. The last option prevents the default printer on the client computer from being the default printer on the terminal services session. In most cases, you will want to leave this unticked. When this option is unticked, this means the default printer on the client is the default printer used on the terminal services session. Essentially, this means when the user prints in the terminal services session, the output will go to the default printer the user normally uses. Lastly, there is the Security tab. When selecting the Security tab, you will get an information message saying to change the Remote Desktop Users group instead of this tab. If you want to change who has access to the terminal server, it is recommended that you add users to this group rather than changing the security settings. In most simple terminal services deployments, I would simply add the domain users group to this group if it is not already there. This allows all users in the domain to access the terminal server, but at the end of the day, it really depends on what your needs are. As you have seen, a lot of settings can be enabled and configured by modifying the RDP TCP properties. These settings can also be configured through Group Policy. In Group Policy, the settings are found in Computer Configuration, Policies, Administrative Templates, Windows Components, Terminal Services. Using Group Policy you can set the settings on any number of terminal servers at once. This can be a real time saver if you have a large number of servers. Group policy also allows you to set some settings that are not in the RDP TPC properties. For example, in printer redirection, you can set fallback behavior and easy printer driver first. You cannot set either of these two settings inside terminal services configuration. These two settings give you more control over drivers used when printing. If you are troubleshooting strange printing problems, you may need to configure these options. Previously, to configure group policy, you would need to use Active Directory users and computers to make changes to group policy. In Windows Server 2008, group policy is not available in Active Directory users and computers. Instead, you need to use the new tool, Group Policy Management. Group Policy Management is available by default in Windows Server 2008. However, if you are running Windows XP or Windows Server 2003, I would suggest downloading the Group Policy Management tool from Microsoft. Even if your domain only has Windows Server 2000 domain controllers, Group Management tool is a great product for managing group policy. It is a good idea to spend some time looking through group policy to see what settings are available. Let's have a look how to set some of the settings in group policy. The Group Policy Management tool is in the Start menu under Administrative Tools. It is a big improvement over Group Policy Management found previously in Active Directory users and computers. I have already created an organizational unit for my Terminal Services server and placed my Terminal Server computer account in this organizational unit. To create a new group policy, I right-click on the Terminal Services OU and select Create a GPO in this domain and link it here. You are free to call your group policies anything you like, but I like to put GPO after the name so it is clear that they are a GPO. Next, if I right-click on my new group policy, I can edit it. The settings for Terminal Services are under Policies, Administrative Templates, Windows Components, Terminal Services. If I select the folder Remote Desktop Connection Client, I can see a number of settings that will affect the end user's client software. For example, in a secure environment, you may want to select Do not allow passwords to be saved. This will stop passwords being saved to the local computer. You may also want to consider using this on shared computers. Take note that when I click on Group Policy Settings, a description of the group policy will appear on the left-hand side telling you about the policy. Group policy can be a bit confusing, and sometimes group policy settings will not work unless another group policy setting is also set. Make sure you read the description to ensure that you have also set any dependency policies as well. If I go into the Terminal Services folder, you can see there are a number of subfolders for settings that are configurable in Terminal Services console. If I open connections, I can limit the number of connections and also set how the server will handle disconnections. If you have a lot of terminal servers, you may want to enable settings on all of them, for example, remote control. As you can see, I can set the remote control options which will be used on all servers in this OU. This is a lot faster than setting all the servers manually using Terminal Services console. Also, if you have a policy change later on in your company, you can easily and quickly change the settings from group policy. In the real world, if you have one or two terminal services, you probably won't use group policy. If you have a large number of terminal servers, then using group policy to administer them becomes a real time saver. At the end of the day, it really depends on what your needs are. From group policy, you can specify your licensing settings and licensing server. From here, I can enter my licensing server rather than having to change it on each server. Keep in mind that the settings will not change on the server till group policy is refreshed. If you require quick changes to your servers, you will need to manually refresh group policy or use an automated group policy refreshing tool. As well as the connection properties, Terminal Services also has a number of server-wide settings. These settings affect the whole server rather than the connection settings which only affect the sessions made through that connection. At the server level, you can set how the server will handle temporary files and also set User Login Mode, which will determine if multiple logins are permitted or not. You can also set licensing settings, and finally, if you're using Terminal Services Broker, you can configure its settings. Let's have a look how to set these settings. First of all, open Terminal Services configuration from the Start menu. On the welcome screen, you can see what the current settings are set to. To change any of the settings, right-click on one of them and select Properties. This will open a window with all the settings for that server. You can see here, there are two settings for controlling temporary files. By default, both are switched to on, which creates one folder per session and removes the temporary folder after the user logs off. This gives you the best security, but can reduce the performance a little. Next, you have the option to restrict each user to a single session. If you need to have the same username logged in from more than one computer at one time, you will need to switch this option off. Lastly, you'll have user logon mode. This is new to Windows Server 2008, so expect an exam question on it. By default, all new connections will be allowed, but if you select Allow Reconnect but prevent new logons, new users will not be able to log onto your server. If a user is disconnected from their session, they will be allowed to reconnect to their session but not create a new one. This allows you to prevent new users logging onto the server, but also allows the current users time to log off. The last setting I really love. It essentially does the same thing. However, once the server is rebooted, it will switch back on to allow all connections. When I need to reboot my server, I simply select this option. Then I go into Scheduled Tasks and I schedule a reboot during the night. After everyone has gone home and logged off, the server will restart during the night when there is no demand. When the server starts up again, it will be ready to accept new connections. I love this feature because it allows me to have a life outside work. The next tab is Licensing. If you decide to change your mind on how your server is licensed, you can set it here. Take note at the bottom, you can specify a licensed server or servers. The auto discovery mode should be able to find your licensing server. However, if it is having problems, you can manually specify the licensing server. If you have users not being able to log onto your terminal server because the server cannot find the licensing server, I would suggest manually entering a licensing server. That's it for server settings. TS Session Broker will be covered in Terminal Services Load Balancing, so I will